Welcome to episode 21 of Indestructible, Indestructible, Latin America with Rodrigo Acuña. This podcast is a collaborative effort between myself and Alborada, an independent voice on Latin American politics, media, and culture based in the United Kingdom. I am a contributing editor of Alborada and am based in Sydney, Australia. If you like the content of this podcast, you may want to consider supporting us on Patreon. All of our patrons are now receiving a small selection of references to articles, podcasts, and books which deal with some of the key topics discussed in each episode. Another way you can support us is by simply sharing this episode and letting your friends know about this podcast. You will find us on Spotify under the name Alborada, which is spelled Alborada, and on Twitter and Facebook under Indestructible Podcasts. On Instagram, you will find us under the title Indestructible Pod. If you follow international politics, the country of Nicaragua would have come up on your radar at some point. During the decade of the 1980s, the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations became obsessed with overthrowing the left-wing Sandinista government from office in Managua. In power since they overthrew the brutal US-backed dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in 1979, the Sandinistas inherited a country with a debt of $1.6 billion US, roughly 30 to 50,000 war dead, over 600,000 homeless, and an economic infrastructure that was left devastated due to the dictatorship's corruption and war against the insurgents. Despite the intense war waged by the United States by funding the Contra Army in neighboring Honduras against the Sandinistas, who were themselves essentially Somoza's old National Guard, the Sandinista government saw massive improvements in literacy and health, adopted a mixed economy, and held elections in 1984 that were recognized by the United Nations. Many practicing Catholics were part of their government. In 1990, after a decade in office and despite their many achievements, the Sandinistas were voted out of office as the Contra War left 30,000 dead Nicaraguans. For the next 16 years, Nicaragua then saw a series of right-wing governments which reversed many of the revolution's achievements. By 2006, the country had an official unemployment rate of 11%, with a further 36% underemployed. Later that year, the Sandinistas won the presidential elections with Daniel Ortega at the helm. Since then, stories in the mainstream corporate press on how President Daniel Ortega has centralized power or imprisoned political opponents have widely circulated, while reports of US economic sanctions, electoral interference, and support for an attempted right-wing coup d'etat in 2018 have largely gone unreported, unless you read specialized literature or independent progressive media outlets. This, of course, is not to say that Ortega's government is not above criticism. In order to get a better understanding of what is going on in Nicaragua these days, I recently spoke to Professor Dan Kovalik, a North American human rights and labor rights lawyer and peace activist. Dan teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, having contributed many articles in US media outlets such as Counterpunch and the Huffington Post. Dan is the author of numerous books, including The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the US is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil, No More War, How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests, and Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture. His latest book is Nicaragua, A History of US Intervention and Resistance, and was published earlier this year by Clarity Press Inc. I now leave you with Dan Kovalik. What inspired you to write Nicaragua, A History of US Intervention and Resistance? And when did you first travel to Nicaragua, Dan?
Yeah, well, so I first traveled there in 1987. I was 19 years old, and I spent a month in Ocotal, which was at that time a war zone because it is on the Honduran border, which is where the Contras were operating from. And that trip really was very impactful on me, and I've been going to Nicaragua ever since. So in some ways, the book grew out of a many years' interest and dedication to Nicaragua, but was inspired at the time I wrote it, really by the confusion I think that the people, particularly outside Nicaragua, have had as a result of the events in 2018. The crisis in 2018, which, you know, people on our side of things call, you know, the coup or coup attempt. And I wanted to kind of set the record straight about that, but in the larger context of history.
Mhm. Now, in the first chapter of your book, you talk about the North American historical figure William Walker and his importance to Nicaraguans. For those who are unfamiliar with Walker's story and the broader history of U.S. interventionism in Nicaragua, could you speak a little about this for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting figure, a strange figure. He went to Central America in the early 1850s with actually the goal of creating a U.S. Confederacy in Central America, and he reestablished slavery there, and in particular Nicaragua, which had abolished slavery. And he went with the support of the Democratic Party, which, of course, at that time was the party of slavery. Remember that, of course, Lincoln was a Republican. Obviously, those parties end up kind of switching perspectives on the world later, but up until really the 1960s, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, then party of segregation, and so he was supported by the Democratic Party to go there and again to establish this confederacy in Central America. He had some success, initial success in doing that. He declared himself president of Nicaragua. Ultimately, he was killed. And there was a Nicaraguan who famously did the deed by, I believe, throwing a rock at him, or at least that's what the famous painting shows. And I think that's really the initial interaction between the U.S. and Nicaragua, which had been a Spanish colony, of course, for centuries before. And then after the 1850s, it was the U.S. that began to try to dominate Nicaragua.
Moving on to the latter part of the 20th century, in 1972, a massive earthquake hit Nicaragua, while in 1979, the US-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza fled the country after being overthrown by a popular revolution headed by the Sandinista Front of National Liberation, the FSLN. Could you talk to us about those events?
Yeah, the earthquake in 1972 really was the beginning of the end for Somoza. Not because of the earthquake itself, but because of how he dealt with it. And that was that he and his cronies stole nearly all the aid that was sent to Nicaragua for the earthquake, which was very devastating, which pretty much leveled Managua. If you go to Managua today, there's only one tall building that I know of, maybe a couple, and it was the, I believe, Bank of America building. It's now a government building, but that's the only building that stands from that period because it was leveled by the earthquake. And the world reacted by sending millions of dollars of aid, both financial and otherwise. And Somoza saluted it all. And this became very well known. Even the American newspapers talked about this. So it was not a secret. And this really, not surprisingly, enraged the Nicaraguan people who were already upset with Somoza. But this solidified the opposition to him. Even the business class in Nicaragua by this time turned against him. And this would ultimately lead 7 years later to the Sandinista victory in overthrowing him in 1979, but not before Somoza inflicted a lot more harm on his people. As I mentioned in the book, in 1978 alone, the last year of the insurrection against him, Somoza's forces killed about 50,000 Nicaraguans, which was a huge percentage of the population because there was only about 2.5 million Nicaraguans at that time. And he did so mostly by aerial bombings of his own cities. But yes, that was not enough to prevent him from being overthrown.
And of course, he comes from a dynasty which had been in power, I think, since the early 1930s, if I remember correctly.
That's correct. He was the third Somoza to rule over Nicaragua. The first was his father, who was put in power by the U.S. Marines, who really organized and trained the National Guard, and he was the first leader of the National Guard, the brutal National Guard that would keep the Somozas in power until 1979. And he would eventually declare himself the president of Nicaragua, and he would rule, and then his two sons would rule until 1979. The last Somoza was the second son to rule over Nicaragua.
Now, through the decade of the 1980s, the Sandinistas were in power, holding multi-party elections and being praised by organizations such as Oxfam for their programs in literacy and health. This decade also saw the creation of the brutal US-backed paramilitary group known as the Contras, which from neighboring Honduras would attack soft targets inside Nicaragua, aimed at discouraging support for the revolution. That's essentially attacking civilians. By the end of the decade, when the Sandinistas lost power in 1990, in the 1990 presidential election, some 30,000 people had been killed. I understand that from 1990 until 2006, when the Sandinistas were out of power, Nicaraguans again saw massive poverty rates, over 800,000 children not belonging to any educational institution, and some 1.5 million people suffering from hunger on a daily basis. In a brief manner, could you summarize and maybe just highlight some of the key points of these two eras?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes. So the 80s would be, should have been really the era of the blossoming of the Sandinista revolution, and in some ways it was. The Sandinistas immediately moved to build a huge literacy campaign, largely wiped out illiteracy. It created a free healthcare system, and engaged in also a national inoculation campaign to wipe out diseases in the country. Did a lot of very progressive things very quickly. But sadly, the 80s became really better known for the Contra Wars you mentioned, and the Contras grew out of the National Guard. That should be pointed out. So the National Guard was overthrown by the Sandinistas in 1979, but the U.S., along with the Argentina, and which at that time was governed by a fascist junta, moved very quickly to organize the National Guard into the Contras. And the Contras were really an arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, ultimately. They got all of their direction, support, organization from the CIA. And as you mentioned, they ended up killing another 30,000 Nicaraguans on top of the 50,000 that the National Guard had killed in 1978. But in addition to that, they destroyed the Nicaraguan economy, their actions, which were basically terrorist actions against not just people, but also civilian infrastructure. That combined with the U.S. blockade of Nicaragua, with the CIA's mining of the harbors of Nicaragua, and CIA's destruction of oil installations, all those combined to really undermine the Nicaraguan economy and the gains of the revolution. So by the time 1990 comes, there is a lot of dispiritedness amongst the Nicaraguan people because of all this, not surprisingly. And basically the U.S. extorted the Nicaraguan people, and 1990 made it clear, look, you have a choice. You can vote for the Sandinistas, but if you do, we will continue the Contra War. We will continue the economic blockade, and, you will continue to suffer. And, given that choice, the people reluctantly voted for the Contras. Well, that's funny, against the Contras, and for Violeta Chamorro. and voted the Sandinistas out of office, who did step down, by the way, voluntarily. And the Sandinistas really were in the wilderness until, as you mentioned, 2006. And during the 1990s and into the early 2000s, when these neoliberal governments were in office, they did everything they could to destroy the Sandinista social programs. Again, allowed people to slip back into poverty and illiteracy. And these were very dark times and very sad times. In Nicaragua, I mean, I think even worse than the 1980s. I mean, in the 1980s, at least there was hope despite the war, but in the 1990s, there wasn't a lot of hope. And that brings us to 2006, when finally the people decided, okay, we've had enough, and they voted the Sandinistas back into power.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, during his time out of office, Ortega was accused by his critics of making a pact with then President Hernando Alemán, a hard-right conservative, in which they divided up control of the country's basic institutions. These are the allegations. Legislated immunity for themselves from prosecution for any criminal charges, and granted themselves seats in the National Assembly. Many leading Sandinistas, such as Sergio Ramirez, etc., withdrew their support for the FSLN and set up the Sandinista Renewal Movement. From his time in office since 2006 until the present day, Ortega, of course, as you would be well aware, has been accused of harshly persecuting his political opponents and of concentrating political power in his hands. Now, you write in your book, and I quote, "I have heard from others who believe that Daniel is by now a reluctant leader, that he is old, not in good health, and would prefer to just spend time with his family. However, he keeps going because there is no one else who can keep the country united and the struggle continuing. To outside observers, this may seem strange and even crazy, and certainly not desirable by the standards we have in the West for our leaders. However, I would submit that there are historical reasons for why this is so, and a lot has to do with the unremitting interference and aggression of the United States. Such foreign intervention has required a leadership in Nicaragua which is strong, relentless, and steady. It has required a leader who is as much a military leader as a political one." You go on to say, "Daniel has been this leader his entire life. The Nicaraguans recognize this. He is one of the last guerrilla leaders left who endured the struggle against Somoza, against the Contras, against the neoliberal leaders, and against the violent insurrections in 2018. Almost all of the other Sandinista leaders dating back to the struggle against Somoza are either dead or they retired some long ago." How would you summarize Daniel Ortega's time in office since 2006? And what do you think are some of the criticisms that are fair towards him, and some of the criticisms that you think are unfair towards his government?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to address the pact really quickly. I mean, basically, I think you fairly summarized what the pact was about, but I think it was a very tactical decision that Ortega made to be able to allow the Sandinistas to come back to power through the ballot box. Ortega is a very practical, pragmatic, but also very cunning politician. And of course, the pact worked, and he was reelected. Essentially, it allowed him, by agreement, to have a lower threshold of percentage of voting to be able to become president on the first ballot, which happened. But later, then he would start winning with huge majorities. But again, he needed that pact to make the initial success in 2006. So I don't see that as a weakness. I see it as a strength. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people do question him making those decisions, but time usually proves that he was right in making those decisions. Now, the criticism is that the Sandinistas have become kind of personified in one person. in the person of Daniel Ortega. But is that his fault, or is it the fault again of history and circumstances? I think, as you quote me from the book, I mean, Nicaragua has been through terrible, difficult times because of extreme U.S. intervention, right? The U.S. Marine invasion in the early 20th century, the setting up of the National Guard, the imposition of a dictatorship, the Somoza dictatorship. And then when the Sandinistas win, the U.S. is not done, right? Then they set up the Contras. And then they have years of neoliberal governments, which really punish the people economically. And Ortega's the one individual that really was able to overcome those things. And the Nicaraguan people are grateful to him for it, and they love him for it. I mean, that doesn't mean all the Nicaraguans do. Obviously, there are people who don't. But the people who do love them are the base of the revolution. Poor people, peasants, workers. And that's what I think people have to understand. He is good for those people. And those are the people that if you're a revolutionary, you should care about. And that's who I care about, the more bourgeois people generally resent him. And that's a good thing. And people have told me that. The fact that they resent him means he's doing the right thing. I mean, I think it's not ideal to have the revolution personified in one person, like the Cuban Revolution became personified in Fidel Castro, or the Chinese Revolution in Mao Zedong, or the Russian Revolution in Lenin or Stalin. But you see, and Michael Parenti, I quote him, has made the observation, that's not ideal, but look at history shows that tends to happen across countries and cultures, not necessarily because of the individuals involved, but because of the historical pressures of keeping a revolution together in the face of Western imperialism and intervention, and in the face of course, domestic counter-revolutionary activities. And so you end up having these more centralized parties that govern, and they're centralized many times in one individual that really leads the show. And so I think Ortega, again, is more of a product of those historical forces. And to that extent, I think if one looks at it in that lens, that it's more acceptable, But the other thing is, I guess I maybe mentioned this in the book. I mean, the other thing is, those who live in glass houses should not cast stones. In the U.S., we have the Clinton dynasty, right, with Bill Clinton, and people would have been happy had Hillary Clinton become president. You have the Bush dynasty with the two Bushes who held power for 3 terms. People talk about wanting Michelle Obama to run, or the Obama daughters to run for office. You have the Kennedy dynasty. I mean, this is not alien to our societies either. And it doesn't make those things bad. I mean, really, the question is, are those dynasties good or are they not? People tend to like the Kennedy dynasty. The others I'm not particularly excited about, but I think we have to be also self-reflective about how in many countries people do turn to really familiarity, which gives comfort to people, in terms of how they vote.
And you also do actually mention, you go into some details of the statistics on the social indicators. So his government actually has been delivering for those poorer Nicaraguans. All the medical and the literacy programs are back on. The creation of these electrical grids that you talk about. So I think that's a strength in your work to highlight that yes, there is a a concentration or there's this figurehead that people like to focus on, but his government's actually delivering for average Nicaraguans.
Absolutely. I mean, what Nicaragua looks like today is nothing like it looked like in the 90s or 80s. I mean, the infrastructure that's been built, the roads, 26 world-class hospitals that have been built since Ortega was reelected in 2006. Again, literacy sky high, healthcare, free healthcare reinstated when he came back into power, free housing that's been built. I mean, it's a different place. And the irony, of course, is it was even a different place for the business class. They did very well under Ortega. They've done very well, but they turned on him anyway, but he has improved the country. And that's why the comparison that people on the right like to make between Ortega and Somoza, saying Ortega's another Somoza, completely break down. Somoza did nothing for the Nicaraguan people. He didn't build roads. He didn't do anything for them in terms of healthcare or education or poverty alleviation. Again, when you look at the earthquake of 1972, it showed what Somoza was about, and that was he was about, enriching himself to the detriment of his people. And you cannot say that about Ortega. And you cannot compare his army or his police to that of the National Guard. Those are not repressive forces. In fact, the police of Nicaragua have been recognized in this hemisphere as one of the best professional and community-oriented police in the hemisphere. So, yeah, I mean, you have to look at the results and how he has treated the people, and he's treated them very well.
Now, just briefly, there is of course one of the most vocal critics on looking at the regional politics, which is Chile's center-left President Gabriel Boric. And when the Nicaraguan judicial system saw, I think, something like 222 prisoners who participated in the 2018 attempted coup against the government released and then expelled to the United States, Boric on his social media stated, and I quote, "The dictator does not know that the homeland is in the heart and in one's actions and is not deprived by decree," end quote. What could you tell us about this division within the Latin American left, and why do you think Boric in particular has become so hostile towards the government of Nicaragua, when in contrast to Cuba, which is like Venezuela and like Nicaragua has been under intense economic sanctions, the posture is quite different?
Yeah, well, first of all, Boric, I would not even describe as center left. He might have been at some point. I would now describe him as center right. I mean, I think he's changed as much as anything in terms of his political alignment and his alignment vis-a-vis the United States. I think it's fashionable, if you want to be friendly with the U.S., to criticize Daniel Ortega, and so he does that. In terms of the event that you mentioned in particular, yes, it's true that he sent 200 some people who were involved in a brutal coup attempt in 2018, which took the lives of over 200 people, which really undermined the economy, which did billions of dollars in damage to the economy and infrastructure and public buildings. If you compare it, say, to the January 6th insurrection in the U.S., which people really certainly believe people should be held accountable for, it's no comparison. It was much more damaging to that country, to the society, to the economy, than a few-hour, event in the United States. And all Nicaragua's done is try to hold those people to account. Ultimately, yes, they were sent to the United States. They weren't killed, right? They engaged in high treason. In many countries, they would have been shot. Instead, they were given a free ticket to the United States, which is a country they'd love to live in anyway. All of these people are very aligned with the United States. So I do not see that as a huge human rights violation. The one thing you touch upon, I will say, I have myself find a little baffling and hard to understand, and that is why Nicaragua is treated, I would say, by the left, many of the left of the world, differently than Venezuela, and certainly different from Cuba. Cuba, which continues to be a darling of the world left, and it should be, by the way. I love Cuba. Don't get me wrong. But why is Cuba so much a darling and not Nicaragua? When, frankly, let's be honest, I mean, Cuba has a one-party system, right? I mean, Nicaragua is a multi-party system. So if you care about what we think of as, democratic forms, Nicaragua would be better in terms of that than Cuba. I mean, that's just a fact, right? So why is Nicaragua so pilloried? It's hard for me to understand. And I would say the interesting thing is, between the three countries, Nicaragua's more successful. It's doing better than Cuba and Venezuela. Much better economically, much better socially. I mean, to me, especially in the Western left, there seems to be almost a defeatism. It's kind of this infection of Trotskyism. I'll just be, to play inside baseball here. It's almost like successful revolutions are not well thought of. If you're successful, somehow you're doing something bad or wrong. They've succeeded where these other two countries are not succeeding, to be perfectly blunt. And somehow they're resented for that. I think that, again, is a reflection of the left and how pathetic the left has become. Again, a very defeatist movement. That's my own view.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, you quote two North Americans who I understand live in Nicaragua, and this is in relation to the attempted coup d'état in 2018. They say, since at least 2010, examining WikiLeaks cables, Department of State memos, NED, USAID budgets, and documents seized in arrests of 2018 coup suspects, it is clear the US has expended perhaps as much as $200 million to oust the Ortega-led Sandinista government. They add, and I quote, "The US Embassy and USAID have been preparing the conditions for a coup from some time since at least 2013. Their efforts culminated in the April-July 2018 coup attempt." Now, for our listeners who might not be aware of those events, could you just explain very briefly what took place in Nicaragua in 2018?
Yeah, so in 2000, first of all, I mean, at $200 million, when you talk about Nicaragua, there's only 6 million people there. That's a huge amount of money being poured in per capita. I mean, it's extraordinary. And it's very potent, that would tend to have a huge impact in a country like Nicaragua. It's still relatively a poor country. And it did have an impact. So in 2018, there was a incredible societal crisis in which at first it looked like there was some sort of popular uprising against the government. And there were claims that the government had responded by murder, by killing students, which ended up not being true. But those who were promoting this coup with support from the US were very adept at using social media and promoting these lies of government repression. And even people very sympathetic to the Sandinistas were taken in by this, many of them, and there were massive, very peaceful, by the way, demonstrations against the Sandinistas, which were allowed to happen. But very quickly, what looked to be initially possibly peaceful became very violent. And you could say that those peaceful protests were hijacked by very extreme forces, but I would say those extreme forces were behind this to begin with. And they set up these tranques in major cities, hundreds of these tranques, I believe thousands of tranques, these barricades in cities and towns, which prevented, commerce, which undermined the economy, which people had to cross every day. And when they were crossed, they were harassed by the people set up at the tranques, some of whom were criminal. gangs who were brought in to man the tranques. People were raped at these tranques and killed. This was a brutal, brutal coup attempt under the guise of being some sort of popular protest movement. And ultimately, as I mentioned, over 200 people were killed in the spring and summer of 2018 in this violent insurrection, for lack of a better word. And public buildings were destroyed, including, for example, the historic building in Granada, which I believe was built by the Spanish in like the 1600s, which even William Walker, who burned down the city, didn't manage to destroy. It's a terrible event. And the interesting thing is, early on, the Catholic Church demanded that Ortega take the police off the streets because the claim was that it was the police committing the violence. There was much confusion as to who was doing it. And the interesting thing is, Ortega, again, much to the chagrin of many of his supporters, immediately said, okay, fine. And he took the police off the streets and committed them to the barracks for 50 days. 50 days, 50 days. And again, people say, you're insane. Why are you doing this? But he understood a couple things. One, that he'd make this concession to the church in the interest of trying to bring the temperature down. But also he would show the people who was actually committing the violence, because the violence actually continued and even escalated. Well, if the police are in their barracks and the army never left their barracks and the violence is continuing, it's clear who's doing it, and that's these people on the tranques, right? And so by the end of the 50 days, the people finally, they had realized who was doing it. They realized who their friends were and who their enemies were, and they called on the government to return the police to the streets and clear this up. And by the time, by the way, this happened, the tranques were burning out anyway on their own steam, and they were able to remove the tranques relatively peacefully without bloodshed, which was the third reason that Ortega made this decision. They could have sent in the police immediately to forcibly destroy those tranques, but it was Ortega's belief that instead of a couple hundred people dying, you could have had thousands of people dying. He didn't want that to happen. And so ultimately, he was able to resolve it in a much more peaceful way than otherwise. And that is the story of the 2018 insurrection, which most Nicaraguans now understand. People from the outside, by and large, don't understand that those were the dynamics, because, again, the West was so good at really manipulating the situation, manipulating the facts and the reality. And I think a lot of people, even on the left in the West, are still confused about those events.
Mm-hmm. Dan, and you've actually just published, I think, the third piece in the Morning Star on those events. So I'd definitely be pointing our listeners to that publication. Dan, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to ask you very, very quickly. In your book, you really tell some remarkable stories of Nicaraguans and US peace activists who, like yourself, have attempted to change US policy towards Nicaragua. The story of the Vietnam veteran turned peace activist S. Brian Wilson was very touching. I'm just wondering if you could maybe just share one or two stories very briefly on some of these remarkable people that you've met on your travels to Nicaragua.
Yeah, well, there's many expats living in Nicaragua from both the United States and Europe who are just amazing people. All of them, to a person that I know of, are involved in community work, are involved in political work to support. They're there to build the Sandinista revolution, and they are accepted as Sandinistas. The Sandinistas are incredible. The Nicaraguan people are incredible. Like, they don't see you as like appropriating their culture or revolution, right? They welcome anyone who wants to support the building of a new society is welcome to be there. And many people went there in the 80s and they stayed there and they live there to this day. S. Brian Wilson is the most famous because he literally gave his limbs for the people of Central America. As you say, he was a Vietnam veteran. He was very disheartened very quickly in Vietnam, but what he saw, which was that the war was aimed really at civilians and not at armed actors there. He came back, became a peace leader, and he engaged in this act where he, along with several others, sat on a railroad track to protest rail shipments of arms to Central America. And the railroad train that they were trying to prevent from going to Central America, instead of slowing down, sped up and hit him. It destroyed one of his shoulders, part of his brain, and destroyed both of his legs. And yet he has continued to be a peace activist. He now lives in Nicaragua. He is a Nicaraguan stalwart. He's a Sandinista stalwart. And he is considered a hero of the revolution. And he's very beloved in Nicaragua. And again, he's one of the more kind of dramatic examples of people who've given their lives for Nicaragua because Nicaragua has given them so much, including people like me. I would say Nicaragua made me the person I am today. And I feel very grateful and want to give back to Nicaragua for that reason.
Dan Kovalik, labor rights activist, academic, champion of the poor in Latin America. Thank you so much. Your latest book, Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance. Thank you for talking to us at Alborada's Indestructible podcast.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
As always, I would like to thank Alborada for this opportunity to host Indestructible. Once again, I would encourage our listeners to support this podcast on Patreon, which you can do this for as little as the price of 1 cup of coffee a month. My sincere thanks, as always, goes to Alborada's founder and co-editor Pablo Navarrete, who produces this podcast. If you have any comments on this episode, please write to us on our email, which you will find on Alborada's website. We'll be back soon with episode 22, but until then, goodbye and stay safe.